Paycheck America in a $1 trillion market. More Americans are walking a financial tightrope, even as Wall Street looks richer than ever. A new analysis of Bank of America data reported by USA Today finds that nearly 1 in 4 U.S. households is now living paycheck to paycheck. For lower income families, it's closer to 3 in 10, with millennials and Gen X feeling it most. Wages at the bottom have stalled, while rent, groceries, childcare, and debt just keep creeping higher. At the very same time, the stock market has turned into a 10-company club, essentially. Roughly 10 mega cap firms now make up about 40% of the entire S&P 500, and that's about 20% of the entire stock market worldwide. A tiny slice of people who own a lot of stock are riding that wave. On the ground, you see the strain in places like Tampa. The pandemic boomtown is now foreclosure ground zero, with the highest foreclosure rate of any big metro in the country. Add in private sector union membership down below 6% and a federal minimum wage frozen at $7.25, when the 1969 minimum wage would be a little over $14 in today's money. And the story's pretty clear. Fewer people and fewer companies are capturing more of the gains, while the middle class lives one missed paycheck away from losing the house. Okay, so what's the real message here? Yes, stock market is booming. No, we're not in a recession, but more and more Americans are living on the edge than ever before and just falling off the edge, or at least since the Great Depression or the Great Recession. 1 in 4 people are living paycheck to paycheck, meaning they get one paycheck off, all of a sudden they're bouncing checks. They have no money. That's an extraordinarily stressful place to live. I've lived there before. Thankfully, not in a long time, but I've lived there. In fact, I did when I was in Tampa. I lived in Tampa 30 years ago, and it is and was a beautiful town. It's an interesting town to me because it doesn't have all the celebrity culture of Hollywood. It doesn't have the big city high tech of San Francisco. It doesn't have all the big Wall Street money of New York City. And yet it's still a pretty big metropolitan place. It was, even though I was not even a part of the middle class when I lived there as a struggling talk radio host 30 years ago, it was a place that was very much a middle class culture. You saw what seemed to me like most people living in nice communities, 2,000, 2,500, maybe 3,000 square foot homes. And they didn't have big glamour jobs. They weren't Wall Street wizards. They weren't entrepreneurs. They had middle class jobs in private sector companies. Now they are losing their houses. So what happened? Now, it's not really specific to anything in Tampa, although they are an emblem of this. What we are seeing is a hollowing out of America's economy. We're seeing more and more of the wealth go to a handful of people who either work for one of the top 10 tech companies or someone who feeds on those big companies. Now, I've been very fortunate, certainly for the last 25 years. I've had clients who are often a part of these top 10 companies. Plus, I've invested heavily in the stock market, specifically tech companies. So it's worked out for me, but that shouldn't be any consolation to you or others. It's certainly no consolation to the rest of society. So what's really going on? Now, there have been recent political campaigns, as you may remember, in America that said, let's make America great again. The implication that things used to be better. Now, this has sometimes been accused of being racist, sexist, because in the past, in the 50s and 60s, minorities were discriminated against openly, blatantly. Gay people were discriminated against. Women did not have a fair chance in most corporate worlds. But, and this is a big but, there was a huge, huge middle class in America. Income was dispersed in a much more diffuse way throughout our economy. You had a lot more people not living paycheck to paycheck. You had people able to afford a house, a car, a middle class life, a vacation once a year. So some have said, let's make America great again. And all we have to do is round up all the immigrants and get rid of them. Well, we had immigrants back in the 1950s and 60s. So that's not the source of the problem. What has changed? We had international trade in the 50s and 60s. I'll tell you what I see is in the 50s and 60s, you had roughly a third of the country in the private sector in unionized jobs. And as much fun as it is to say unions are wasteful and inefficient, what they did is they were able to get incomes at a middle class level for tens of millions of Americans. Today, only 6% of Americans in the private sector work for unions. So if you're really intent on making America great again, like back in the good old days, 50s, 60s, even 70s, one solution is organized labor. Now, I realize that's not popular. That's not going to get me a lot of sponsorships from the Walmarts of the world or the Amazons of the world talking like that. But that is one reason why many, many Americans felt like they lived in the middle class in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and no longer do. Maybe you were you had a job driving a bus at an airport back and forth in a shuttle and had a nice middle class income in the 60s. And today you're an Uber driver and you're on call all the time and you don't have control of your own schedule. And after you factor in gas, depreciation in your car, insurance, maybe you're making $3 an hour sometimes, which can be the case for Uber drivers. So you've seen people who were not wealthy, but in the middle class going way, way down. And technology has made it easier than ever for companies to not have employees. The other thing, these 10 companies that are doing so well, the Alphabets of the world, the Amazons of the world, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the things that's making them do so well is they keep firing employees and they become more profitable. So if you think, well, all I got to do is get a job with one of these 10 companies, that is increasingly not a solution for most Americans because these companies have figured out how to use AI or how to offshore so many employees. They don't need you or me if you are an American. Now, another thing that's different about our society, again, it amazes me. People say, let's make America great again. Things need to go back to where they were. Well, in 1969, the minimum wage was at a level that if you had just kept up with inflation today would be almost $15. And this is what the minimum wage was during Richard Nixon's first year of office. Richard Nixon, you may or may not remember, a Republican, a conservative, an anti-communist. And when he took office, the minimum wage in America was the equivalent of $15 an hour today. And these days, if you're a politician and you say, I want a $15 minimum wage nationwide, you are ridiculed. You are mocked as a far left radical. That's absurd. So this is an example of how the sort of the Overton window of what's respectable to even talk about has changed so much in America and has shifted so far right. What was a mainstream position, indeed, what right of center politicians lived with, as Richard Nixon did live with a minimum wage that's the equivalent of $14, $15 a day, something that was considered centrist or right of center. These days, if you're a politician, first of all, you're not even going to mention it if you're a Republican politician saying, let's raise the minimum wage to 15. You would be ostracized and laughed out of town. But even if you are a Democrat and you say, I think we should have a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour, that's the lowest you can pay people in America. You would be instantly branded as a part of the radical left. Well, you're a socialist. You must be a Fidel Castro fan. Well, there is a reason why so many Americans can't pay their bills and are having their homes foreclosed on and are living paycheck to paycheck. Is because for the average person, their income has gone down, even though the wealth of the country has gone up. Certain people have been lucky, and I've won that lottery ticket myself, but it's not filtering down to most Americans. So if you think it's a problem, if affordability is something you think is important, there are two things from the past that did a lot to make things more affordable. And that was stronger unions and a higher minimum wage. I realize they're not popular to talk about in many circles. This is not going to get me 10 billion likes on this video or this podcast or the talk, but it's time someone told you the truth, and I'm here to tell you the truth. My name is TJ Walker, and I'm here as a sane, sensible centrist. This is not a political talk show fest. This is not Sean Hannity or anyone on MSNBC. I'm giving you analysis of the top business stories, technology stories, and culture stories, and then filtering them through the lens of communication skills and personal development skills. So the real message I have here, unfortunately, from a personal development standpoint, is if you're going to be an American and you were born here or you moved here and you want a nice life, you got to realize our culture's changed radically. As a society, we have decided we don't really want a middle class. We have decided that everyone wants to have this fantasy that they're going to be wealthy, and they're going to be the top 1% or the top 0.001%. And it's just one Bitcoin gamble away. It's one bet on Kalshi away, and you too will be a billionaire. It's a fantasy. It's a collective fantasy we've told ourselves. And realize if you don't buy into that fantasy, and I don't, if you don't buy into that fantasy, you got to do something about it. And that means you're going to have to work harder. You're going to have to be more entrepreneurial. You're going to have to learn new hard skills and sell yourself, whether it's to big companies or individuals. And you got to realize no one's looking out for you. Our whole political structure is designed increasingly to make it easier and easier for venture capitalists like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel to get whatever they want and to write the rules to make it easier for them to fire people, outsource, pay people who used to have minimum or lower middle class incomes to pay them peanuts on apps because it makes them richer. And technology is making it easier and easier for a few people to win big. And let me not be a hypocrite here. I've benefited from this. I used to compete with my public speaking training and media training services with thousands of others in the United States. Most of them are not in that business anymore. How did I do it? I was, in some sense, lucky, but I got my courses, my public speaking, my media training, my personal development courses on every platform before most of my competitors did. And I got mine on the most popular platform earlier than anyone else. And just because I was first, I got to the bestseller status of so many of those courses and categories like public speaking and storytelling and media training. So it helped me tremendously. I got to have 12 million students, which is what I have now, 12 million student enrollments in my courses. A lot of people who started later ended up with crumbs. So it really was a winner take all situation. And that's happening again and again and again in our economy. So that's what we have to deal with.